The world looks on as Russian President Vladimir Putin launches a full-scale attack on Ukraine. And now it's becoming clear that he intends to use his country's military might in a bid to rewrite European history. The West, meanwhile, has been imposing what have been described as the toughest sanctions ever, but Putin is clearly not impressed. So is it time for Europe's democracies to face up to some new and uncomfortable truths and perhaps fight for their future? On To The Point, we ask, Ukraine under attack, is Europe powerless against Putin? Well, thanks very much for joining us here on the show. And my guests in the studio include the historian Ulrike von Hirschhausen, who says Russian tanks invading Ukraine teach us one clear lesson. We need a broad collection of tools if we are to realize our international responsibility. Also with us is Vendeline von Bredow from the Economist magazine, who believes Vladimir Putin has damaged his country. The EU is still Russia's biggest export market, and Western sanctions will hurt. And a warm welcome too to Matthew Karnitschnig, Chief Europe Correspondent for Politico. And Matthew argues that Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine illustrates the failure of European and especially German foreign policy, which for years has focused on trying to placate Putin. Well, thank you very much for being with me today. I'd like to begin with Ulrike. And Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has come out and said Vladimir Putin wants to destroy Ukraine. Is that going too far, or is that an accurate description of where we are now?
I would say Putin wants to destroy Ukrainian autonomy, not the Ukrainian nation as such. Mm-hmm. But of course, what he's doing right now is trying to revival of an imperial idea of a great Russia. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the imperial idea of a great Russia.
Well, in the 19th century, the Ukrainians were used to to be called small Russians, you know, mm-hmm. little Russians, yeah. Whereas Russians were seeing themselves as great Russians. And this is an idea of dependency, which Putin wants to revive today, which is totally out of time.
Does Putin want to destroy Ukraine?
No, I agree with Ulrike. I think he wants to subjugate Ukraine, but obviously not destroy it. He wants to maybe rule over the country and make it part of greater Russia. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be a destruction.
It's been described as a tragedy, a catastrophe for Europe. What do you say, Matthew?
I say it's a crime. It's not a tragedy. A tragedy denotes something that has to do with fate. And what we're dealing with here is a criminal. And it's completely clear. I disagree. I think he does want to destroy Ukraine as a nation. Mm. He might not want to, bomb it into the Stone Age, but he wants to remove the idea from people's minds that Ukraine is an independent nation. And I think this is a continuation of what we've seen in the past with the Soviet Union. They tried something similar by, the forced Russianization of parts of Ukraine. It's not an accident that in the Donbass, for example, where there are a lot of Russian speakers. Well, why are there so many Russian speakers there? One reason is that this is a coal mining area, that the Russians sent a lot of Russians in there decades ago to work in the coal mines and in the industry. And I think this is something that has a long history there, where they've tried for generations, the Russians, to dissuade people from embracing their Ukrainian heritage, and he sees himself, I think, in this tradition.
You're nodding.
I do.
I'm very concerned about the extent to which Vladimir Putin is. You talk about violence, you talk about criminal energy. Vladimir Putin is like a bully in the schoolyard. How do you deal with a bully? We know how to do that. How do you deal with Vladimir Putin?
I think a big problem is that Europe, but particularly Germany, has lost sight of its responsibility. And in Germany, in the last 15 years, there was a path of Germany first. And I think we have to redo that and take on our responsibility also on a military dimension.
How does that work?
Matthew, you're the expert.
Well, how does it work? I mean, it's something that you can't do overnight, but now unfortunately, we're seeing the errors of the past, and especially Germany's, not just the refusal to really invest in its military or to help Ukraine. We're also seeing the strategic errors that Germany made in supporting the Nord Stream projects, in my view, even after it was clear what Putin was doing. This isn't something that happened overnight with him. He signaled already in 2007 what he wanted to do in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference then, and a couple of months after, he started implementing his plan with the cyber attack on Estonia, which basically shut down their internet. It was the first such attack of its kind on that scale. And he followed up a year later with the attack on Georgia and then Crimea, and the wars in East Ukraine, and beyond that, of course, what he's done in Syria, Libya, the assassinations, including in Berlin, of a Chechen rebel here, Alexei Navalny. The Germans sort of looked at that and said, well, we still can talk to him. We still need dialogue with him. This is the only answer, is dialogue. And we're going to continue to pursue these gas projects with him, because if we bring him into the fold, then, we're going to be brothers, basically. And, well, that's turned out not to be the case.
Well, your question was, how do you deal with a bully? And unfortunately, the bully understands the language of strength. And I agree with Matthew. We haven't really spoken that language. We tried. And now, even now, in that recent crisis, we tried diplomatic channels. I mean, one after the other. Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, the various foreign ministers, they all went to Moscow. They all tried. They were basically humiliated by Putin and by Lavrov. And it didn't work. The diplomacy didn't work. I do, however, think that Putin radicalized over the years. I think there was a time when maybe diplomacy and friendship could have worked. There was a famous Putin speech in the Bundestag where he says, Russia is friendly, Russia is a friendly European country. And I think, in a way, we missed an opportunity then, but now it's, of course, far too late.
Ulrike, you wanted to add something?
I think it also has to do something with his obsession with history, which has been growing over the years. And you were mentioning the dates. 2007, he was making clear that safeguarding Russian minorities beyond the Russian border is one of his main duties. And then that became stronger. 2013 and 2014, he annexed Crimea, saying this is part of Russia. And now last year, we had this Aufsatz, this paper, which he sent to German historians.
A remarkable essay.
Yeah. Exactly. By now, you all know this paper, where he made explicitly clear that Ukraine is part of Greater Russia. So I think his obsession with his version of history has contributed to that. And this is also one argument why I think it will not start to affect the Baltic states. This is, of course, a question which we all are questioning ourselves. But I do not think that he will start to occupy the Baltic states, A, because they are NATO members, and B, because they don't fit into his version of Great Russia.
OK, the world according to Vladimir Putin. Let's just have a listen to one statement from the Russian leader.
Whoever tries to interfere with us, and even more so to create threats for our country, people should know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to such consequences that you have never experienced in your history.
How do you deal with a bully? That was the question. And Matthew, the answer is, in that statement that we've just heard, is that we are dealing with a nuclear option, possibly.
Well, he's leaving it to people's imagination. It's clear that Russia has tactical nuclear weapons that it could use in a situation like this. Of course, I think he knows that if he were to do that, then he would be endangering his own country's future. But, he's clearly serious about what's going on in Ukraine. And in a couple of weeks, we'll know how successful he has been there. And I think whether he moves into the Baltics or not, I don't think that he's going to do that right away. But I think that it will lead to a remilitarization of the eastern flank of NATO. And this is going to be a major shift in Europe's security architecture, the most major shift since the end of the Cold War. Because up to now, the NATO countries had agreed, there was a agreement with Russia not to permanently station troops in the Baltics or in the former Warsaw Bloc countries. I think that's going to go out the window now, and we're going to see permanent NATO bases, more American troops in Europe again, and especially on that eastern flank. And all you need to do is look at a map to see the countries that border Ukraine. So it's going to be a much more dangerous neighborhood than it has been.
I was going to say, Vendeline, this is a very sensitive part of the world with a very sensitive history. Tell us a little bit about that as the backdrop to what we're seeing now, because we are sitting here in Germany, in Berlin, which was where so many of the crimes committed in this sensitive part of the world, they started back under the Nazis.
Absolutely, and our closest neighbour is Poland, and Poland has, of course, historically suffered a lot. It's suffered at German hands, at Russian hands, and the Poles feel very fragile, very vulnerable. They've been arguing for more help from NATO for years, and now, you know, they were proven right. And of course, the next line of defence, in a way, or the closest you get, are the Baltic states, and also not only are they even closer to Russia and to Ukraine, but they're also very small. So, and they've equally suffered a lot, but from both sides. Always, you know, they were always sandwiched between the Russians and the Germans, and historically, and so of course it's a completely different mindset in these countries, and I think they've been asking for our support for years, and we should have probably been even more steadfast than we have been, but now, you know, just by the force of events, it'll happen belatedly.
And I suppose one of the questions is are the people of Ukraine going to? We're talking about, you know, whether the Germans or NATO will offer support and what shape or form that support might be, whether it might be of a military nature. What about the people of Ukraine themselves? Are they going to put up a fight against Vladimir Putin?
I do think so. If we look at the amount of identification with the Ukrainian nation, it has increased very much over the last 10 years, also due to the permanent aggression of Putin. And if you look at how many people are now recruited in this civilian force, which of course doesn't play a big military role, but it has a symbolic role of, you know, yeah, I do think that there will be much more identification, even more than before, with the Ukrainian nation.
And are we talking about people taking to the streets, or are we talking about people really engaging in civil disobedience? Are we talking about, you know, a possible insurgent war?
I don't believe in that. I do think that more men will voluntarily take up the arms within sort of regular forces. And this is what Zelensky has, you know, asked people to do. But
well, let's just get a quick word from Mr. Zelensky. Let's hear what he's been saying and how his mood is.
Behind me stands Ukraine, with its internationally recognized borders. And it will remain the same, no matter what. No matter the statements and actions by Russia, just as we remain calm and confident.
Statement of intent, a very strong intent.
I think that the Ukrainians are going to fight. One of the big questions here that some of us have been looking at over the past several weeks and wondering about is what, if it came to an invasion, what would Putin's ultimate goal be? And I think there's, you know, a theory, sort of the consensus of people I spoke to about this is that he would try to basically divide the country along the Dnieper River, which runs through Kiev, and then, you know, basically keep under his control the eastern part, what they call left bank Ukraine, and then the western part would, you know, remain as a kind of a rump state, and that is where, you know, you, I think, will see insurgencies or something similar to that. People will keep fighting there. He's also moved into Odessa already, which is the key Black Sea port for Ukraine. Most of its trade goes through there. It's also seen as the pearl of the Black Sea. It's very important historically and culturally for Russia as well. But if Ukraine is robbed of that, then it's going to be, sort of squeezed economically as well. So it will need a lot of Western support. And I suspect that the United States and other NATO allies will be quite happy to help finance some kind of an insurgency there.
I was going to say we haven't mentioned the American perspective at all on this. So, people right outside the European theatre might think, well, for the Americans, this is happening in Europe. If there is a war, we see an invasion, we see perhaps the beginnings of an occupation, it'll be in Europe. It'll be a long way from the US. But it's very important for the Americans.
Well, European stability is very important for the United States, obviously. For economic reasons, for a lot of other reasons. The United States was engaged in the Cold War, obviously, for many decades in Europe. And I think that successive administrations in the United States took their eye off the ball when it comes to Russia, when it came to Putin, and they misjudged him, and they didn't take the threat that he posed seriously enough. And that goes right up to Joe Biden, who thought that he could concentrate on China, and the threat that the United States feels China now poses to both the United States and the West, and leave Russia to the Europeans. But this was also true under Trump, although he, despite his reputation, supported more sanctions against Russia than anyone else, but also of Barack Obama, who dismissed Russia as a regional power, which was a slight, I think, that Putin neither forgot nor forgave. And I don't think anybody is looking at this situation now and is saying that Russia is just a regional power.
I think the mistake that's often made is to sort of look at Russia's GDP and say, well, it's actually, smaller than Italy's, and hence it's as you said, and just a regional power. But it's not. It's the biggest country in terms of its geography in the world. It has vast natural resources, and it has nuclear weapons. So you cannot say it's just a regional power, and that we made that mistake. I think it was a misreading of the facts.
You sound just a little bit, or at least it could be construed that you sound like somebody in Germany who's been much criticised in the last week or so. The people who have tended to, over the years and more recently, placate is the word that is often used, placate Vladimir Putin. Yeah.
No, I'm not in favour of that. I think that's a mistake. I think the only language he understands is the language of strength. I think when we should have done the opposite. But I also think that for many years, certainly the Americans, but in a way also Western Europe, underestimated Russia's intention, misread the intention, and didn't quite understand, how serious Putin is about rebuilding the greater Russia that he's dreaming about. Mm-hmm.
There's a big debate in Germany at the moment about what, to use a German word, but the words can sometimes be so very evocative, the Wehrhaftigkeit of Germans, the German military, in the current situation, the current crisis. Can you explain the debate and the Wehrhaftigkeit? The
Wehrhaftigkeit, as far as I understand, is just whether Germany could even defend itself, could fight a war, if you will.
Readiness.
Yeah, the readiness, exactly. I'm not a military expert, but from what I understand, the Bundeswehr is not in great shape, and so I'm not sure.
Okay, let's have a look at a report that we have on the situation in the Bundeswehr, where there are several sort of overlapping problems.
They still exist, the peace marches to which pacifists in Germany call. But they're not as big as they were in the 1980s, when hundreds of thousands demonstrated against the deployment of American short and intermediate-range missiles. There are also still protests at the annual swearing-in of Bundeswehr recruits. The Bundeswehr, Germany's military, has shrunk in recent decades. From about 500,000 soldiers in the 1960s, only a third remained after the end of the Cold War. The enemy was no longer in the East, and national defense was no longer the sole mission. Instead, German soldiers fought together with the Allies in Afghanistan, among other places, and alongside the French in Mali. Both foreign missions are considered more or less to have failed. Bundeswehr equipment is inadequate. Above all, there's a lack of transport capacity. Only a small number of helicopters are even operational. The Americans in particular have long complained that NATO partner Germany invests far too little in its armed forces. And further, there seems to be a lack of political strategy for the tasks of the Bundeswehr. Is Germany at war with its military?
Well, that's one question. Is Germany at war with its military? I think also, I mean, the question might be, is it time for Germany to really beef up its armed forces? That's been a very important debate, and it's central to Germany's own credibility.
I would agree with Mr. Bredow. We really need to speed up. In 2014, when Putin annexed Crimea, 28 NATO members agreed on spending 2% of their gross product on defense. And we are right now, I think, around 1.5 or so. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a strong responsibility of Germany to take up its responsibility in a way. And what I think is we need a more broader, how should I say, maneuverability, is that word exists in English? Yeah. To have sort of different political means of power, a broader repertoire of power in Germany, and not trusting only in economy to use its way, but rather to use political, military, cultural and economic means.
This is, Matthew, about, I mean, for most of us, the people living here in Germany, living in Central Europe, liberal democracy is what we cherish. Liberal democracy is what we hold up as sort of what we believe in many, many ways. The question is, are we willing to defend it?
Well, you've had the luxury of not having to defend it, and I think that is part of the problem here, that there isn't really a security culture in Germany. There are in other parts of Europe, but in Germany in particular, for the last 75 years or so, the country has lived pretty well under the security, or at least the western part of the country, under the security umbrella provided by the United States. So people haven't had to worry about these issues, and Germans have gone about sort of looking at their own past, at World War II, the whole discussion about the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, as they call it, sort of confronting their past and so forth. And this process has, I think, turned people away in general from all things military, which unfortunately has created a situation where it is often looked at as something sort of morally untoward to want to go into the German army, say. And that's one of the reasons now that the Germans have a huge problem with the resurgence of extremism in the ranks of the Bundeswehr, of the German army, because the only people who really want to go for the wrong reasons often. So I think this is a much deeper problem that is not just about money. It's about creating a culture and helping people understand why military is necessary. And I think that Germans have really lost that.
I agree with Matthew. I think in the years after the war, it was probably the right decision for Germany to take a very low profile militarily, right? And to basically, and I think the Americans then were very willing to protect Germany and to have Germany live under its umbrella. But now, you know, that's a long time ago. And Germany has, in a way, just continued to do that because it was convenient, because it suited the population, the public opinion. But things have to change. And the reputation of the Bundeswehr is a big issue, because if it were better, if it were like in America or in France even, you know, then it, you know, it would attract better people. The Bundeswehr wouldn't have a problem to recruit people, and the problem of extremism, which is a real problem in the Bundeswehr, would probably not be such a problem.
And I would like to bring in the historical dimension in this, because one of the arguments for not having enough deterrence is, of course, World War II. Mm. But if we look at it, who suffered so much were the Ukrainians. Ukraine was one of the main war theatres in World War II, deportations. The majority of German Zwangsarbeiter, forced labor, were Ukrainians. So I don't see the argument to be valid. And I think we have to really look at the facts. This
is one of the strange aspects, I think, of the dynamic between Germany and Russia, is that the Germans feel this historic debt to the Russians, and this is sort of really infused this entire debate over Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, and other issues with Russia, where the Germans have said, well, we have this historic debt that we need to honor, and we need to give the Russians the benefit of the doubt. But as you say, I think most Germans aren't aware that actually more Ukrainians died as a percentage of the total population than Russians. More Belarusians died as well. And this is just something that's not discussed here.
Are Germans, are Europeans powerless against Putin?
I think that they are powerless for the moment. I think they're going to become much more reliant on the United States again as a result of this, and all of these discussions in Europe about strategic autonomy are going to end very quickly.
OK. Thank you for summing it up there. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And if we've given you plenty of food for thought, then do come back next time. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.